We've covered a lot this term, right? We started off just talking about what philosophy is, right? Sort of trying to appreciate the fact that we're going to be asking a lot of questions and maybe not getting satisfactory answers to those questions. So, does that feel like you're an accurate description of what your experience was? A lot of questions and maybe not satisfactory answers. What do we think? Is accurate? Anyone? Hopefully you found some that might seem interesting, right? Or at least have prospects for being good, right? I like to think of philosophy as a continuing discipline, right? So a lot of people do talk about philosophy as a way of life. And this is maybe a way to think about that, right? These are evolving questions. And maybe the reason that we haven't come up with any satisfactory answers yet is we haven't gotten it quite right yet. And so maybe we can learn, right, useful things from the theories that have come before us and hopefully not make the same mistakes if those theories did make any mistakes, right? Certainly the feminists that we've seen have had something to say about that, right? The social consequences of adopting certain theories throughout human history and the implications of that, especially, right, what we've been talking about at the end of the quarter in terms of our values, what we value in this life. Okay, so this last bit of the quarter, after going through a lot of those big questions, which maybe you did or did not find satisfactory answers to, hopefully you at least found the questions interesting and maybe make the world seem a little bit more unclear, right? Which is exactly what Russell said the value of philosophy is, right? That uncertainty. Maybe we're less certain about things now than we were, but maybe that's okay. Okay. So this leads us into what we're talking about next week and what we're going to be talking about today, which is the question about life as a whole and whether or not life has meaning. And we're going to be using some terms that correspond with what we're covering this week in axiology, that distinction between objective and subjective. Right. So in terms of aesthetics, we were discussing whether or not aesthetic value judgments were objectively true or subjectively true. Okay, so who can remind us what is the distinction between objective and subjective? What does it mean when I say something is just subjectively true? Good, yes, we mean it something like an opinion, which means that the truth or falsity of that statement, of that judgment, depends on the individual person, right? There is no way of checking outside of that person in the world to see if they're correct or not, right? So we can say people have different opinions and none of them are right or wrong, right? That's what we mean, right? So when we acknowledge that there's disagreement, if those positions are subjective, then that disagreement is okay, right? Because the truth of the statements is just relative to the person. Right? Or we could expand it even a little bit more largely to a community, right? And say it's socially relative, right? In that sense. But still, right, we're saying that there's nothing outside of all of humanity that we can point to and say that's where we can look at the correct answer and then determine who is right or wrong. Whereas objective is that very idea, right? So where we may associate subjectivity with opinions, we might associate objectivity with things like what we call facts, right? The idea is that there is something out in the world, a matter of fact, such that when people disagree about objective statements, there is a right or wrong position, right? So they can't both be correct if there is an objective truth value, right? And so we were discussing about how aesthetic value judgments about what is beautiful or what is considered art could be objective or subjective. So now, or what we're going to be covering next week, we're going to be discussing whether or not life has meaning. But as you can guess, even if you say yes, have meaning, you're going to have to account for what type of meaning it has. Does it have only subjective meaning, or does it have an objective meaning for everybody? Right? So that's going to be the big whole this week. So any questions so far about what I mean by objective or subjective with respect to the meaning of life? Lots of tired faces. I understand. Okay. So when we're asking whether or not life has meaning, right, what exactly are we asking? Well, there are a couple different ways we could interpret this, right? We could be referring to whether or not someone is just happy, right? So often we associate someone having meaning in their life with them being happy. Sometimes we can assign a moral judgment, right? Going back to ethics, we can assign the idea that if someone's life has meaning, then what they're doing is maybe right in some way, or they are virtuous, right? If they're pursuing a meaningful life. Okay. But usually, again, we can talk about happiness and rightness distinctly from meaning, right? So, specifically, when we talk about whether or not life has meaning, we're talking about specifically its significance, its importance, or its final value. So, not just value in general, but what is the final end value of life? Significance or importance. Right today. And, that human component just tends to be, a bias from most historical philosophers, but we could also talk about whether or not, right, animals lives have meaning, right? There could be other forms of life that could have meaning as well besides humanity, right? That is a potential position one could take. But so when we ask whether or not life has meaning, that is what we're talking about. Okay. So we're not just talking about whether or not someone is living a righteous life, right, or a virtuous life, like we discussed in ethics. We're not just talking about whether or not someone is happy. Okay. So those are, we could imagine someone who's happy, but maybe doesn't have a meaningful life, right? Or maybe there's even a sense in which someone might be able to have a meaningful life, even though they're not happy. Could we maybe think of an example like that? Can any of you think of an example of someone whose life you thought was meaningful in some sort of objective way, even though they were not happy? Oh, Maria, I'm sorry. Yes, our parents. Yes. My parents have not historically been the happiest individuals. Depression runs in the family for sure. But yeah, right. We would want to say our parents' lives have meaning. Good. Anyone else? Any historical figures we can think of? Any famous people that you know of who were historically unhappy, yet their lives were obviously significant and meaningful given their place in history? Yeah, lots of famous authors, artists, right? Was it Van Gogh who, almost took his ear off? Right? Number of famous writers, especially, right, committed suicide. Same with musicians. Yeah, right. So there again, we don't just want to associate it with joy, right? Even though hopefully there we want joy to be part of a meaningful life. But again, these things can be separate. Okay. So even if you're thinking of some sort of ideal, we're specifically talking about the significance, the final end, which a person ought to seek in order to have a meaningful life. Right. And so we want to ask ourselves these questions again. They come up a lot. It can come up especially in times of loss, right? If you've lost someone close to you, or if you're facing your own mortality, right? I don't know if any of you, in philosophy, I tend to have a lot of friends who are much older than me, right? Much closer to the ends of their lives, right? And so these existentialist questions, right, become very important because most of their life has behind them, right? And so they're reflecting back on it and trying to garner some significance, right? To frame some meaning for it. We also might ask ourselves about the impact of external forces, right, on our life and whether or not they have meaning, right? Especially in times like we're facing now with so many instances of global conflict and warfare and again, going back to philosophy of religion and the problem of evil, so much what seems like completely unnecessary suffering, right? We might ask ourselves, why? What is the point of all of this, right? What is the meaning of life? Such that we can point to it and say, that is why we ought to stay alive. That's why people ought not commit suicide, right? That's why we ought not murder each other, right? That's why we ought to value and take care of one another. Why? What is the significance of life, right? That makes all of those other things moral imperatives, right? Or the right thing to do. Okay, so that's what we're seeking this, what will be next week, but what we're going to be talking about today. And so just to start you off, I maybe should have done a trigger warning. I apologize. I've already mentioned suicide, but self-harm, obviously, we're going to is discussed right away. And I didn't mean to be so cavalier about it. I don't mean to take it lightly. It is a significant topic, but it's one that is exactly related to the topic at hand. And so it's something that Albert Camus, right, one of the philosophers that you're going to be reading about next week, starts right off the bat, right? He says, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, right? Metaphysics, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, some more metaphysics, maybe related to some epistemology, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer the fundamental question, right? So just why keep living? Right? That is what he thinks is the fundamental question here. Okay, so in response to those questions, right, we're going to have a lot of different responses. And so there's a lot of nuance here that I'm not going to get to go over in great detail, but I am going to go over, let me take a screenshot of this for you, this nice little chart. So we'll get a sense of the various options that are going to be available to us in terms of answering this question. And again, philosophy, lots of options for you to choose from. No indications from me as to which one is the right one. So asking these big questions, getting lots of possible answers, but hopefully there's something in here, again, from which you're able to glean some significance. But to get a sense of why we might ask this question, right? Some people might think it's really obvious. Do any of you think that the meaning of life is like really obvious, and why are we asking this question? Anyone? Think like it's very clear, the value of life. Nobody? All right, so maybe we're feeling, oh, let's see, I think it's entirely subjective. Okay. All right. So then it wouldn't be clear, right? That's subjective because some people wouldn't have that sense. Okay, so in case anyone is wondering, maybe you're just not comfortable sharing it out loud, but in case anyone is wondering why we might be inclined to answer this question, or why might some philosopher think this is the fundamental question, right? The thing that we should be asking ourselves. I wanted to show a little video. I hope this is going to work, Hannah. I hope the sound works on your end. Hopefully, if you can hear me, you can hear the video. So please let me know if it's not working. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. to give you a sense of scale. I guess you didn't even really need the sound, but the music was nice. But maybe some of you have seen a version of this from Carl Sagan's show that I'm totally Cosmos, right? I think they redid it with Neil deGrasse Tyson, but it starts with that very famous shot of what is known as the pale blue dot, right? Where it just zooms out from Earth and keeps going and going and going, right? Out through our solar system, right? Past other planets, and then it's just such that Earth becomes so tiny you don't see it anymore, right? So, right, the idea is that oftentimes we get caught up in life and all of these conflicts, right? All of these problems, all of these questions that we've been asking all quarter long. But when it really gets down to it, like, what does it all matter? Why are we bothering to ask these questions? What is so significant about human existence, right? In the grand scheme of things, such that the things that we care about and our little trivial worries, right, are of such great import to us. And not just in terms of humanity, but each of ourselves, right? We have a problem that seems like the end of the world in our life, right? And I don't know about any of you, but does it ever help you to, and I guess this is maybe like geographical privilege, but often being able to go near a body of water has helped me like deal with problems like that, like being reminded of how small I am, right, in comparison to the large universe of things. Do any of you have experiences like this? Are you, is this too existential for you? Or at the mountaintop? Yes, right. There are lots of points in nature, right, that where one could have this experience of being made to feel small, right, that there's something bigger than you, and that's not a bad thing, right, that there's something reassuring about that. Why might we be reassured by being made to feel small? Normally, that's not a good thing. We don't associate being made to feel small with anything good. So why might that help someone to feel small? How does it take off the stress of daily life? How does it do that? Because you're absolutely right. That is what it does. I mean, for me, maybe not for everybody, but I think there's a commonality here, maybe. Yeah, it makes the issue feel insignificant, right? So yeah, it's not just that it makes you feel small, right? We don't tend to often enjoy being made to feel small, right? The Buddhists have had a lot to say about that. We really cling to our egos, right? So the idea is that we don't tend to like being made to feel small as people, but when we're having big problems, to make that problem seem small, right, can often be a very relieving feeling, right, an experience, right? And we say things like, oh, that put it in perspective, right? Meaning that it seemed really big, but maybe there is some subjectivity, right, in terms of significance and meaning. And so while that problem is really big relative to my life and my day, it's not so big relative to all of human experience, right? And it's certainly barely a blip, if not a speckle of dust in the grand scheme of the universe, right? That means nothing, right, in terms of the lasting impact of those things. So yeah, right, the idea is that there can be some relief in that, right? So there's a sort of tension that philosophers are going to be trying to struggle with here, right? This feeling, this intuition, right? Philosophers, as we've noticed, they place a lot of value on intuition, even though we need to, right, in analytic philosophy, the goal is then to come up with a rational justification for it. There is an intuition, right, that our lives are meaningful, right, that they're significant. And you could be purely an evolutionary naturalist about it and say that, well, we just think that way because it keeps us to survive, right? It gives us that drive to keep living. But right, maybe you think it's something else, something more than that, right? But again, if we do think that, we have to try to figure out what it is, right? And so that is leading us to this graph, right? So we're starting off, and I can nope. Share my screen again. right? And so the idea here is that when we ask ourselves, what does life have meaning, right? Of course, there are going to be two possible answers. When we answer yes or no, we're going to have to stipulate whether or not we mean something subjective, right? Which in this case is going to be cashed out in terms of something internal to a specific person, okay? Versus something more objective, or what here is going to be described as external, okay? So yes, life has meaning, but does it have meaning just for each individual person, or does it have meaning for everybody? No, life doesn't have meaning because of some feature of individuals, right? Or no, life doesn't have meaning because of some feature, right, universal to all individuals. Okay, so when we classify these views, yes, life does have meaning. Those are just generally going to be referred to as optimistic views. Okay. The views that classify that life does not have meaning, right, whether subjectively or objectively, are going to be classified as pessimism. Now, it's important to note that they're not pessimists in the sense that they think we should give up on life. All of these individuals are going to say, no, life doesn't have meaning, but they're going to try to give an account of why we should keep living anyways, right? What they're doing here is just giving a reason for why life doesn't have objective meaning or subjective meaning, right? And so for them, they're just accounting for what they call the absurdity of life or the lack of meaning. So where does life's absurdity come from? Okay, where does life's meaning come from? That's what the bottom part is going to refer to, right? So these are going to be our accounts of what makes life absurd, or it's going to be our accounts of what makes life meaningful. Okay, so I'm going to stop and come back. Any questions so far? Terminology. Okay. So when we look at the idea that yes, there is going to be this internal optimism. Okay, so yes, life does have meaning, but that meaning is subjective. So something like what Lunaria was saying, it's coming from something within oneself, right? That means, again, we can have some differentiation. That thing within oneself that provides meaning could be the same for everybody, right? So it might just depend on the individual to find it or not, but it's the same feature of each person that gives life meaning, right? So if you think that being creative, right, is the thing in people that gives life meaning, well, not everyone is going to find that meaning, right? It would be something like that. Or having children, right? Whatever the thing is that you think for humans makes life meaningful, right? All people have the same thing. It's still their choice, right? Whether or not they pursue that thing, right? Or whether or not they agree that that is a thing that they should pursue. Or you could think it is dependent on each individual person, but it's not the same for everybody, right? Each individual person can have their own thing that makes their life meaningful. Now, this can be really interesting because we might want to look at examples, for instance, of maybe someone who sits around and plays video games all day or just watches TV all day, right? And some people might want to objectively say that their life is not meaningful. But if you take this subjective, optimistic account, then you would have to say that their life has meaning for them, right? If that is the thing that they actually believe makes their life meaningful. So how do we feel about that? Is someone's life meaningful if what do we think? If that's what they want to do, sure. And does it matter what they're doing on the screen? They're just mindly absorbing content? Sure. All right. Hannah, what's the sense in your class? Many people a meaningful life as possible. So is anyone's life not meaningful then? Yeah, and so this brings up important questions like again, this reference is getting a little outdated, but since they made a fourth one, I think maybe people know it again. But The Matrix, have you all seen The Matrix? The general premise, do we know what the premise of the film is? Virtual reality, only it's all of your senses, right? Your entire conscious experience is all digital, right? It's not real, right, in terms of the physical world, right? But again, going back to metaphysics, you might think that there are degrees of reality, right? So it has some level of reality in terms of experience. So there's a very famous scene in the first Matrix, right? Because the premise of the movie is that the heroes of the film are trying to break the humans out of the Matrix, right? So that they can make the choice, right? That's the very famous red pill or blue pill choice, right? Do you want to keep being in the Matrix or do you want to go out into the real world? Now, once you go into the real world, you realize that the Matrix is in most ways a lot better, right? How is the Matrix better than the real world for those of us who are familiar with this post-apocalyptic fiction? Exactly, right? You don't have to struggle for your basic survival, right? At least not in this particular Matrix. They didn't, I don't think they showed a lot of homeless people. I have to go back and watch it now. But the idea is that in the Matrix, right, they're eating very lovely food, they have jobs, they've got, they're all pretty much comfortable, right? We would say like middle class. And when they get out into the real post-apocalyptic reality, right, they have to eat this like gross slop that, has all of the chemical nutrients that your body needs, but it tastes gross, right? Everything is dirty, and you're lucky if you're able to bathe and get fresh water, right? So there are many ways in which we think it's better to be out of the Matrix, even though the experience is worse, right? So why? What is it about that reality? What is it about that life, that real life, right, that is important? Or is it going to be okay for people to just opt into a virtual world, right? Or do we think that that life is less meaningful somehow? Now, this less control, yeah, perhaps, right? Because everything is subject to code, right, in a digital space. So far, we haven't put codes in our brains yet. I'm sure that's the future, right? Some chip in the brain. But until then, we have a little bit more control over our physical bodies. Well, there are cops in the real world, but not that type of Mr. No, I forget the name of the agents. Right. Right. So we might think again that it's going to be something subjective for each person. But again, if we take that position, just understand, right, the implications of that we're going to have to be okay with any life being meaningful, right, regardless of what someone chooses to do with it, right? Regardless of whether or not that coincides with what you think makes your life. Okay, so next part is saying that yes, there is something that makes life meaningful, but it is external to ourselves, right? And so there's going to be two versions of this in general, right? One's going to be more theistic and one's going to be more humanistic, right? So there is something that makes life meaningful that doesn't have to do with each individual person. It's something outside of humanity that bestows meaning on our lives. And that's either going to be God, right? Or it's going to be something outside of that. And we're going to see something like moving towards progress, right? The evolution of the human species in terms of the humanistic version of that, right? So the idea is that there could be something that gives all of human life meaning, regardless of what any individual person chooses to do with it. And again, that's either going to be from progress or something related to God. But what's interesting about Augustine's view, which you're going to see for the theistic account, is that even though life's meaning comes from God, in order for your life to be meaningful, you still have obligations. And so you're going to see a really interesting metaphor that he's going to use with a plant, right? So the idea is that, it's not enough for a flower to just merely receive the nourishment from nature, is that you have to reflect those nutrients on other people. And so that's going to be the sort of proselytizing of Christianity in this particular case, right? But if the meaning of life comes from God, of course, you're going to want everybody to partake and have a meaningful life, right? So you have to spread the message of God, right? So some interesting views there. Okay, so we don't have a ton of time left, and I want to get to the other side. So any questions about the views that, yes, life does have some sort of meaning, either because of individual people or because of something outside of us? Okay, so the ones that are far more interesting, they are going to be reading next week, are the views that are going to say that life does not have meaning. But again, I cannot stress this enough. All of them are going to be arguing that life is worth living nonetheless. Okay, so life is still, or what they're going to say is that life can be made meaningful, even if it does not have meaning, right, in that subjective or objective way. Okay, so again, here we're going to be seeing people trying to account for where the absurdity of life comes from, right? Where does the lack of meaning come from? So again, here we're going to see the view that it could either come from individuals, and there again, we'll see a subjective, objective distinction, right? These typically are going to have to do either with the relationship, again, between what we should say is our awareness that we are so small, yet the feeling that our problems are so big. There's a sort of contradiction that comes there that's always going to make life absurd, right? That we're going to see that from Nagel. From Tolstoy, we're going to get a more theistic account, right? But in this case, because there is a God and because life's meaning comes from God, your life is not meaningful for you. Your life has meaning for God, but not for you. So we're going to see some interesting accounts, even where theism might not bestow or guarantee meaning on life in the way that we might expect. Okay, and then the external accounts, we're going to be saying that no, life is absurd, right? For the same reason for everybody. And I think the most famous one of that is going to be coming from Albert Camus. And he has the very famous narrative known as the myth of Sisyphus. Has anyone heard of the myth of Sisyphus before? A dude pushing a rock up a hill for eternity. Ringing any bells? Yes. Yes. All right. So the deal with Sisyphus, right, it's an ancient, I think, Greek myth. And Camus is using it as a metaphor for human life, right? So the idea is that in this myth, Sisyphus is condemned to push a rock up a hill for all of eternity, right? And this pushing the rock up the hill is meant to symbolize what we do every day, right? So Camus starts off by saying, we get up, we take the train, we go to work, we take the train home, we go to sleep, we get up, and we do it all over again, right? And so our lives are in a lot of ways just as absurd and meaningless as Sisyphus's, right? We're just pushing the rock up for what? So that we can buy more things and then continue to work so that we can pay for a house to store all the things, right? I'm sure you all have heard of this worry about, right, participating in the capitalist grind, right? We just work to be able to work some more and continue to work until we die, right? That doesn't strike us intuitively as a super meaningful life, right? And so in that way, again, Camus is trying to say that our lives are like Sisyphus's. However, right, even though our lives are as absurd in that objective sense, right, as Sisyphus's, we can still make meaning in our lives. And for him, and for Camus as Sisyphus in this case, right, the idea is that Sisyphus can make meaning in his life at a very specific point, right? So he's pushing the boulder up the hill, he gets to the top, right? And what happens when he gets to the top of the hill? What does the boulder do? Does it stay there? No, it rolls back down, right? Because the whole day was, you're just going to have to do the same thing all over again tomorrow. So the moment of triumph, right? The moments of success for Sisyphus is the moment at which he decides to go back down the hill with a smile on his face, right? I am going to go down and do this pointless thing again, and I'm going to do a great job at it, right? Almost like a big giant middle finger to the God who said that this is your punishment for the rest of your life, right? And so for Camus, he's going to almost instill that sort of rebellious, spiteful nature towards the absurdity, right? So even if we are like Sisyphus, right, we can still make meaning in our lives. Okay, so I guess that's as cheesy as I'll get for the end of class. It's been wonderful working with you all this quarter. Again, if you have questions for next week about the writing assignment or the class in general, please don't hesitate to reach out. But I hope you all have a wonderful summer, and maybe I'll even see some of you in the future if you need more humanities classes.